Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be reading some Kant and Hume. I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, that's it there. Just going to organize this so I can see it properly. Okay, so this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia. If you just Google it, Kant and Hume and causality, it will come up. So let's start reading. Kant famously attempted to answer what he took to be Hume's skeptical view of causality most explicitly in the Prolegoma to any future metaphysics. And because causally for Kant, it is a central example of a category or pure concept of the understanding, his relationship to Hume on this topic is central to his philosophy as a whole. Moreover, because Hume's famous discussion of causality and induction is equally central to his philosophy, understanding the relationship between the two philosophers on this issue is crucial for a proper understanding of modern philosophy more generally. Yet, ever since Kant offered his response to Hume, the topic has been subject to intense controversy. There's no consensus, of course, over whether Kant's response succeeded, but there is no more consensus about what this response is supposed to be. There's been sharp disagreement concerning Kant's conception of causality as well as Hume, and accordingly, there has been also controversy over whether the two conceptions really, let me see here now, if I'm getting, doesn't seem to let me want to, doesn't seem to let me want to scroll down, which is bizarre. See, it's just caught. Okay, I know what I'm going to do. If you just would give me one moment and I'll sort this out. Okay, here we go. Yeah. There is no consensus, of course, over whether Kant's response succeeds, but there is no more consensus about what this response should be. There has been sharp disagreement concerning Kant's conception of causality, as well as Hume, and accordingly, there has also been controversy over whether the two conceptions really significantly differ. There has even been disagreement concerning whether Hume's conception of causality and induction is skeptical at all. We shall not discuss these controversies in detail. Rather, we shall concentrate on presenting one particular perspective on this very complicated set of issues. We shall clearly indicate, however, more especially controversial points of interpretation arise and briefly describe some of them, of the main alternatives. So let's see. Kant's answer to Hume. In the preface to the Prolegoma, Kant considers the supposed science of metaphysics. He states that no event has occurred that could have been more decisive for the fate of this science than the attack made upon it by David Hume, and goes on to say that Hume proceeded primarily from a single but important concept of metaphysics, namely that of the concept of cause and effect. Over the next few pages, Kant defends the importance of Hume's attack on metaphysical common sense opponents such as Thomas Reid, Oswald Beatty, Priestley, and Kant then famously writes, quote, I freely admit that it was the remembrance of David Hume, which many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigation in the field of speculative philosophy a completely different direction. Thus, it was Hume's attack on metaphysics, in particular his attack on the concept of cause and effect, which first provoked Kant himself to undertake a fundamental reconsideration of this supposed science. Later in 27 to 30 of the Prolegoma, Kant returns to Hume's problem and presents his own solution. Kant begins in 27 by stating that, quote, "Here is now the place to remove the Humean doubt from the ground up." And he continues in 29 by proposing to make trial with Hume's problematic, his crux metaphysicorum, namely the concept of cause. Kant concludes in 30 by stating that we are now in possession of a complete solution to the Humean problem, which adds, "Rescue the a priori origin of the pure concepts of the understanding and the validity of the general laws of nature as laws of the understanding, in such a way that their use is limited only to experience, because their possibility has its ground merely in the relation of the understanding to experience. However, not in such a way that they are derived from experience, but that experience is derived from them, completely reverse kind of connection, which never occurred to Hume." Thus, Kant's complete solution to the Humean problem directly involves him with his whole revolutionary theory of the constitution of experience by the a priori concepts and principles of the understanding. And with his revolutionary concept of synthetic a priori judgments, indeed, when Kant first introduces Hume's problem in the preface to the Prolegoma, he already indicates that the problem is actually much more general, extending to all the categories of the understanding. I thus first tried whether Hume's objection might not be represented generally, and as I soon found that the concept of the connection of cause and effect is far from being the only one by which the understanding thinks connections of things a priori rather than metaphysics, consists wholly and completely of them. I thus sought to secure their number, and since this succeeded as desired, namely from a single principle, I then proceed to the deduction of these concepts, on the basis of which I was now assured that they are not derived from experience, as Hume had feared, but have sprung from the pure understanding. Moreover, Kant soon explains in 5 how this more general problem, common to all the categories and principles of the understanding, is to be formulated. How is cognition from pure reason possible? Or more specifically, how are synthetic a priori propositions possible? In the introduction to the second edition, B edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant follows the Prolegoma in formulating what he here calls the, quote, general problem of pure reason. B19, quote, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? And is in the Prolegoma, Kant insists that the possibility of metaphysics as a science entirely depends on this problem. So here we have Hume's problem. Yes. And then we have Kant's, above that, we have Kant's complete solution to the Humean problem. And what he's going to do is make trial with Hume's problematic concept of cause. Okay. The metaphysics until now has remained in such a wavering state of uncertainty and contradictions is to be ascribed solely to the fact that this problem, and perhaps even the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, was not thought of earlier. Metaphysics stands or falls with the solution of this problem, or on the satisfactory proof that the possibility it requires to be explained does not, in fact, obtain. Kant then immediately refers to Hume, who of all philosophers came closest to the problem. And he suggests once again that Hume failed to perceive the solution because he did not conceive the problem in its full generality, but rather stopped with the synthetic proposition of the connection of the effect with the cause. It is only in the second edition of the Critique that Kant gives such a prominent place to Hume and his objection to causality, serving to introduce what Kant now calls, quote, the general problem of pure reason. By contrast, the name of Hume does not appear in either the introduction to the Transcendentalistic in the first edition. It appears only in the Transcendental Doctrine of the Method at the very end of the book, in the discussion of skepticism versus dogmatism and metaphysics, where Hume's skepticism about causation in particular is finally explicitly discussed. This is not to say, of course, that explicit references to Hume are not found earlier in the text of the first edition. Thus, for example, in a preliminary section to the Transcendental Deduction, Kant illustrates that the need for such a deduction with the concept of cause, and in both editions remarks, appearance certainly provide cases from which a rule is possible in accordance with which something usually happens, but never that the succession is necessary. Therefore, a dignity pertains to the synthesis of cause and effect that cannot be empirically expressed at all, namely, that the effect does not merely follow upon the cause, but is posited through it and follows from it. But it is only in the second edition that Kant then goes on to mention David Hume explicitly as one who attempted to derive the pure concepts of the understanding from experience, namely from a subjective necessity arising from frequent association of experience from custom, which is subsequently falsely taken for objective. This striking difference between the two editions clearly reflects the importance of the intervening appearances of the prolegoma. Given the crucial importance of the prolegoma in this respect, it is natural to return to Kant's famous remark in the preface to that work, where, as we have seen, Kant says, quote, it was the remembrance of David Hume which many years ago interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a completely different direction. It is natural to wonder in particular about the precise year to which Kant is referring and the specific events in his intellectual development he has in mind. However, we now enter a controversial terrain where there are basically two competing narratives, both of which reflect the circumstances Kant could have read. Okay. So Kant might be referring to us on the one hand, the late 1750s or the mid 1760s. So that's one way of looking at it. Or he could be referring to the mid 1770s, after the inaugural dissertation appeared in 1770. So these are the two alternatives. We prefer the first alternative. From this point of view, the decisive event to which Kant is referring is his reading of Hume's inquiry during the late 1750s to mid 1760s. And this event, we believe, is clearly reflected in two important writings of the mid 1760s. In the first essay, Kant introduces the distinction between logical grounds and real grounds, both of which indicate a relationship between a ground, cause or reason, and a consequent following from this ground. Kant explains his problem as following. I understand very well how a consequent may be posited through a ground in accordance with the rule of identity, because it is found to be contained in the ground by the analysis of the concepts. And I clearly comprehend this connection of the ground with the consequent, because the consequent is actually identical with part of the concept of the ground. However, how something may flow from another, but not in accordance with the rule of identity, is something that I would very much like to have made clear to me. I call the first kind of ground a logical ground because its relation to the consequent can be logically comprehended in accordance with the rule of identity. But I call the second kind of ground a real ground because the relation indeed belongs to my true concepts, but the manner of this relation can in no way be estimated. With respect to such a real ground and its relation to the consequent, I pose my question in this simple form: how can I understand the circumstance that because something is something else is to be, a logical consequent is only posited because of the ground? The fundamental problem with the relationship between a real ground and its consequent, therefore, is that the consequent is not identical with either the ground or a part of this concept. It is not contained in the ground by the analysis of concepts. Thus, using his well-known later terminology from the Critique and the Prolegoma, Kant is here saying that in the case of real ground, the relationship between the concept of the consequent, an effect, and the concept of ground is not of one containment, is not one of containment. And the judgment that the former follows from the latter is therefore not analytic. Moreover, although Kant does not explicitly refer to Hume in an essay on negative magnitudes, he proceeds to illustrate his problem with an example, among others, of the causal connection in the communication of motion by impact. So here we have negative magnitudes. A body A is in motion. Another body B is at rest in the straight line of this motion. The motion of A is something, that of B is something else. Nevertheless, the latter is posited through the former. Hume famously uses this example, among others, in the inquiry to illustrate his thesis that cause and effect are entirely distinct events, where the idea of the latter is no way contained in the idea of the former. The mind can never possibly find the effect in the supposed cause by the most accurate scrutiny and examination, for the effect is totally different from the cause and consequently can never be discovered in it. Motion in the second billiard ball is a quite distinct event from the motion in the first, nor is there anything in the one to suggest that the smaller hint of the other. After a few lines later, Hume describes this as follows: when I see, for instance, a billiard ball moving in a straight line towards another, even suppose motion in the second ball would by accident be suggested to me as a result of their contact or impulse, may I conceive that 100 different events might as well follow from the cause. In Kant's second essay from this period, Dreams of a Spirit Seer, he goes further. He suggests a Humean solution to the problem he has possessed, he has posed, but did not solve. In the essay on negative magnitudes, Kant suggests more specifically that the relation between a real ground and a consequent can only be given by experience. It is impossible ever to comprehend through reason how something could be a cause or have a force, rather than these relations must be taken solely from experience. For the rule of error reason extends only to comparison in accordance with identity and contradiction. But in so far as something as is a cause, then through something, something else is posited. And there is thus no connection in virtue of agreement to be found. Just as no contradiction will ever arise if I wish to view the former not as a cause, because there is no contradiction in the supposition that if something is posited, something else is cancelled. Therefore, if they are not derived from experience, the fundamental concepts of things as causes or of forces and activities are completely arbitrary and can neither be proved nor refuted. The passage seems clearly to recall the main idea of section 4. The passage seems clearly to recall the main ideas of section 4, part 1 of Hume's inquiry, after distinguishing between relations of ideas and matters of fact, and asserting that the former are discoverable by the mere operation of thought. Hume concludes, matters of fact, which are the second object of human reason, are not ascertained in the same manner, nor is there evidence of their truth, however great, of a like nature with the foregoing. The contrary of the matter of fact is still possible, because it can never imply a contradiction. Hume then explains that, quote, all reasonings concerning matters of fact seem to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. I shall venture to affirm, as a general proposition, which admits of no exception, that the knowledge of this relation is not, in any instance, attained by reasonings a priori, but arises entirely from experience, when we find that any peculiar object are constantly conjoined with each other. Finally, and as the first imagination or invention of a particular effect in all natural operations is arbitrary, where we consult not experience, so must we also esteem the supposed type or connection between the cause and effect, which binds them together and renders it impossible that any other effect could result from the operation of that cause. Thus, although Kant does not explicitly mention David Hume in Dreams of a Spirit Seer, the parallels with Hume inquiry are striking indeed. Kant does not endorse a Humean solution to the problem of the relation between cause and effect in the critical period, because with the first edition of the Critique, he does not, as he had in Dreams of a Spirit Seer, claim that this relation is derived from experience. Instead, as we have seen, Kant takes Hume's problem of causality to be centrally implicated in the radically new problem of synthetic or judgments. Yet, the latter problem, in turn, clearly has its origin in Kant's earlier discussion. In the essay Negative Magnitudes and Dreams of a Spirit Seer, of an apparent mysterious connection between real grounds, or causes, and consequences, or effects, just as Kant had earlier emphasized, that the consequent of the real ground is not contained in it, and thus does not result by the analysis of concepts. Kant now in the critical period maintains that the concept of the effect cannot be contained in the concept of the cause, and accordingly that a judgment relating to the two cannot be analytic. Such a judgment in Kant's critical terminology must now be synthetic. It is a judgment in which the connection of the predicate with the subject is thought without identity, where a predicate is added to the concept of the subject, which is by no means thought in it, and which could not have been extracted from it by an analysis. The crucial point about a synthetic a priori judgment, however, is that although it is certainly not as a priori derived from experience, it nonetheless extends our knowledge beyond merely analytical judgments. Yes, so it does extend. Yep. It therefore becomes clear why, in the introduction to the second edition of the Critique, says of the crucial problem of the synthetic a priori judgment that this problem, and perhaps even the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, was not thought of earlier. And then explicitly names David Hume, who among all philosophers came closest to this problem. It also becomes clear why, in the preface to the Prolegoma, why Kant explains Hume's problem as follows. Hume proceeded primarily from a single but important concept of metaphysics, namely that of the connection of cause and effect. And he challenged reason, which here pretends to have generated this concept in her womb, to give him an account of by what right she thinks that something could be so constituted that, if it is posited, something else must necessarily also be posited thereby. For this is what the concept of cause says. He proved indisputably that it is completely impossible for reason to think such a connection a priori, and from concepts alone, for this connection contains necessity, but it can in no way be comprehended. How? Because something is, something else must necessarily also be. and how, therefore, the concept of such a connection could be introduced a priori. Thus, here in the Prolegomena, Kant describes what he calls Hume's challenge to reason concerning the connection of cause and effect in precisely the same terms that he had himself earlier used in the 1763 essay of Negative Magnitudes and the 1766 Dreams of a Spirit Seer, to pose a fundamental problem about the relation of a real ground as opposed to a logical ground to its consequent. What is most important, however, is that the official solution to Hume's problem that Kant presents in 29 of the Prolegomena, this solution depends on the distinction between judgments of perception and judgments of experience, which Kant has extensively discussed in the preceding sections. In 18, Kant introduces the distinction. Empirical judgments, insofar as they have objective validity, are judgments of experience. They, however, insofar as they are only subjectively valid, are judgments of mere perception. All of our judgments are, at first, mere judgments of perception. They are valid merely for us, i.e., for our subject, and only afterwards do we give them new relation, namely to an object, and we intend that the judgment is supposed to be also valid for us at all times, and precisely so for everyone else. For if a judgment agrees with an object, then all judgments about the same object must also agree among one another. And thus the objective validity of the judgment of experience signifies nothing else but the necessary universal validity. Then in 22, Kant emphasizes that the pure concepts of the understanding, or categories, function precisely to convert mere subjective perceptions into an objective experience by effecting a necessary unification. Therefore, the pure concepts of the understanding are those concepts under which all perceptions must first be subsumed before they can serve as judgments of experience, by which the synthetic unity of perception is represented as necessary and universally valid. Here is how Kant formulates this solution. In order to make trial with Hume's problematic conception, crux metaphysicorum, namely the concept of cause, first, there is given to me a priori by means of logic, the form of a conditional judgment in general, namely to use a given cognition as ground and the other as consequent. It is possible, however, that a rule of relation is found in perception, which says that a given appearance is constantly followed by another, but not conversely. And this is a case for me to employ the hypothetical judgment and to say, if a body is illuminated sufficiently long by the sun, then it becomes warm. Here there is certainly no necessity of connection as yet, and thus not the concept of cause. However, I continue and say that if the above proposition, which is merely a subjective connection of perceptions, is to be a judgment of experience, then it must be viewed as necessary and universally valid. But such a proposition would be, the sun is through its light the cause of heat. The above empirical rule is now viewed as a law, and in fact, not as a valid merely of appearances, but valid of them on behalf of possible experience, which requires a completely thus necessarily valid rule. So let's see where we are. On the bottom of page 6. Okay, that's good. All the elements of Kant's earlier discussion of causality in the essays of Negative Magnitudes and Dreams of a Spirit Seer seem to be present here. Kant begins with the purely logical relation between ground and consequent. Since, in the case of the concept of cause, we are dealing with what Kant had earlier called a real ground, Kant holds that we need a synthetic rather than merely analytic conception between the two. The most obvious, though, which Hume had defended in the Inquiry, and apparently following Hume, Kant himself had defended in Dreams of the Spirit Seer, is that of experience. In the Humean sense is the basis for this connection, insofar as one perception is found to be constantly conjoined with another. Now, however, in the critical period, Kant introduces a revolutionary new concept of experience, which is explicitly opposed to mere constant conjunction among perceptions in being necessary and universally valid. In particular, experience is possible only by means of the representation of a necessary connection in perceptions. In Kant's example of 29 of the Prolegoma, then we begin with a merely subjective empirical rule that the perception of an illuminated stone is constantly followed by the perception of heat. And we then convert this empirical rule into an objective law according to which the very same relationship is now viewed as necessary and universally valid. This transformation is effected by the addition of the a priori concept of causality. Quote, the sun is, through its light, the cause of heat. It is precisely this way, more generally, that the categories of pure concepts of the understanding relate to experience. Not in such a way that they are derived from experience, but that experience is derived from them, a completely reversed kind of connection which never occurred to Hume. We shall devote the rest of this article to clarifying Kant's solution and its relationship with Hume's conception of causation. For now, we simply note an important difficulty Kant himself raises in the Prolegoma. Whereas the concept of causality is, for Kant, clearly a priori, he does not think that particular causal laws relating specific causes with specific effects are all synthetic a priori, and if they are not a priori, how can they be necessary? Indeed, Kant illustrates this difficulty in a footnote to 22 with his own example of the sun warming a stone. But how does this proposition, that judgments of experience are supposed to contain necessity in the synthesis of perception, agree with my proposition, urged many times above, that experience as a posteriori cognition can yield only contingent judgments? If I say that experience teaches me something, I always mean only the perception that lies within it. That heat always follow the illumination of the stone by the sun, that this heating results necessarily from the illumination by the sun is in fact contained in the judgment of experience, in virtue of the concept of cause. But I do not learn from this experience, rather conversely, experience is first generated through this addition of the concept of the understanding of cause to the perception. In other words, experience in the Humean sense teaches me that heat always and constantly follows the illumination of the stone by the sun. Experience in the Kantian sense then admits that the succession is necessary. The effect does not merely follow from the cause, but is posited through it and follows from it. What exactly does this mean? This is a very, very, very good introduction to what's going on. It's very intense and high level, but I mean, what more would you like? So induction, necessary connection, and laws of nature. So it starts on page 7, and let's see how long it goes for. Basically, it goes for 7 pages or 6 pages. So where am I now? I mean, in the spirit magnitudes, the negative magnitudes and dreams of a spirit seer, these are pre-critical, the critique of pure reason essays, and according to Garcella de Perius, who is and Michael Friedman, who are the two people who are writing this, they're basically saying, well, Kant was very, very similar along the lines of Hume before the critique, and it's the critique that we get the synthetic a priori. Yeah, so for example, here you get it. Kant does not endorse Hume's solution to the problem of the relation between cause and effect in the critical period. He does not claim that this relation is derived from experience. Instead, as we have seen, Kant takes Hume's problem of causality to be centrally implicated in the radically new problem of synthetic a priori judgments. Yet the latter problem, in turn, clearly has its origin in Kant's earlier discussion of the apparently mysterious connection between real grounds or cause and its consequent effect. Just as Kant earlier emphasized in the critical period that the consequent of a real ground is not contained in it, and as a result and thus does not result in the analysis of concepts. Kant now in the critical period maintains that the concept of cause and effect can not be contained in the concept of cause, and accordingly that a judgment relating the two cannot be analytic. Such a judgment in Kant's critical terminology must now be synthetic. It is a judgment in which the connection of the predicate with the subject is thought without identity. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, next time I'm going to read the induction, necessary, connection, and laws of nature. Okay, until next time, take care.